Do the ghosts of former inmates still roam the halls of this Philadelphia prison?
What happens when 12 violent inmates escape?
Was a dog actually an inmate? And does he still serve time in the afterlife?
Find out the answers to these questions and more as we uncover the frightening hauntings and history from Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Erica.
And this is The Haunted Atlas, a Haunted US podcast.
In the interest of fully exploring history of certain locations, Haunted Atlas may discuss sensitive or disturbing topics. Listener discretion is advised.
Sprawling through a Philadelphia neighborhood, one looming structure sits stoic to the changing times. Its decaying halls spread like long-reaching digits from a center axle, each lined with cells holding memories of souls held against their will. Indeed, the history of Eastern State Penitentiary is vast. Eastern State Penitentiary was opened in October 1829, and it closed in 1970.
Okay.
It actually still had inmates in 1971 because there was a riot, and they were like, there's a place that we can put these people, and even though it had officially closed.
Yeah.
So still in use, but closed formally in 1970.
Did they still have everything in there? Like, everything was running, the water, I guess, but...
I guess. It's only a year. It used the Pennsylvania system, hence being in Pennsylvania.
Right.
Which included isolation, silence, and gradually transitioned away from these tactics into more of a penitentiary as we would know it today.
Okay.
But there's some focus on the silence and really reflection as a whole. Next, I'm going to talk about the most famous warden. His name was Warden Herbert Smith, and he was there during the 1920s and 30s. During his reign, the prisoners in Eastern State were typically in need of reform tactics. You know, this is not just anybody. This is people who need to go to the penitentiary and who need to have experiences with this silence, maybe, or other things.
Right, which is tough. Silence is tough.
In the 1920s, maybe they were still really trying to figure out what worked for people. So why not try a period of silence? It's almost like monks, like a monastery.
Yes, I kept thinking of that scene from Eat, Pray, Love with Julia Roberts where she takes a vow of silence.
Yes.
But obviously not by choice. So definitely a different situation.
Yeah, a little different there. And Eastern State's actually the origin for the word penitentiary, which I did not know. That is so interesting to me.
Yeah.
And so the whole focus of the penitentiary idea is reforming, not punishing.
Right.
So I think before this, we see a lot of jails and prisons focusing on punishment and a lot of blame placed. And this was trying, again, to get into these reform-based tactics. It was designed with this in mind and had some benefits like running water, etc. And fun fact, it actually had running water and heat before the White House did.
What?
I know.
That's so random. Crazy.
It seems so random to me, but I guess if you think about the number of people that were there and this focus on reform, maybe that makes sense.
I guess, yeah, because I don't know how, I know now the White House is staffed, but if it was just the president and their family, maybe they were like, well, only one person's living in there. So it's not super necessary to get everything done.
Maybe when they did it for the White House, they were like, this is going to be a huge undertaking.
True.
And, because it has to look pretty versus Eastern State might not have to be as visually appealing.
Yes.
And there was a sister penitentiary, Western State Penitentiary, which was located in Pittsburgh and could take some inmates if there was overflow needed or they just separated them for various reasons.
It makes sense to me that there's a Western State Penitentiary, but never would have thought to ask if there was a Western State Penitentiary. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and we never hear about it. It's actually, the location is the National Aviary today in Pittsburgh, and I had no clue. I knew the aviary was in Pittsburgh. I knew Eastern State was in Philly. I had no clue that there ever was a Western State.
Yeah.
I just thought it's in the eastern side of the state, hence the name. Now to talk about the reform and treatments that were done there. To me, these are enough to make your skin crawl, let alone all the hauntings. First up, there was the water bath, in which inmates were dunked and then hung on a wall until ice formed on them.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So I thought when I heard water bath, this was going to be sort of like a drowning torture, which is terrifying to me because drowning is one of my worst fears. But this sounds worse. Just like hanging and freezing.
Yeah.
That's horrible.
In Pennsylvania in the middle of winter.
Right.
It sounds brutal. And it actually makes me wonder if this has to be a winter specific thing then. They could not do this tactic during summer.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it would only it would have to be seasonal. Unless this was happening underground. Would it get cold enough underground even in the summers?
Maybe, but they specifically hung them outside on a wall.
Okay, I see.
Another technique used was the mad chair, which bound an inmate so tightly that the circulation was cut off.
Oh.
And sometimes amputations were required.
Oh, that's horrible.
I know. I can't imagine like sitting there and having to endure that. Not that the water bath was good,
right?
But I can't imagine just sitting there slowly feeling your limbs die, essentially.
Yes, and amputations were not performed very well back then. You're risking death at that point, basically.
That's a good point that I did consider. Sterilization was not what it is today.
Yeah.
Another technique was the iron gag, in which an inmate's hands were tied behind their back and strapped to an iron collar in their mouth in a way in which if they moved, it would cause their tongue to tear and bleed. And this was allegedly to emphasize the silence aspect.
Okay, so not Julia Roberts in Eat, Pray, Love.
Yeah, I forgot you made that comparison.
Yeah.
No,
that's quite. Really terrible. I mean, so just moving at all?
Yeah, because it would put like tension into your hands.
Yeah.
So if you moved your hands or your body or like switched positions, it would cause tearing and bleeding. Oh. Again, I think you make a good point with the amputations is Eastern State cites that they're there to reform. While that might have been the idea behind it, these seem like very intense techniques to be using because how do you recover from that if you can't speak correctly?
Right.
You might be reformed and you might not want to commit the crime again, but moving forward in society must be challenging with limbs amputated and issues with speech caused from these tactics or hypothermia that you got on the wall, etc.
Right. Especially because, I mean, I'm thinking physical therapy was not a thing included in the penitentiary. So they were kind of just left to their own devices.
Right. And how do you recover without medical care?
Right.
The final example that I'll give is the hole. This was a dark underground cell where the souls that were placed there had no light, no human contact, no exercise, no toilet, and very little food.
Oh my gosh.
Solitary confinement today is still known as the hole. And I don't know if that's where, I don't know if this is the inspiration for it or if this was called the hole, like all other solitary confinements. But this seems especially bad with the lack of light. What do you do with no toilet?
That was the one that got me. I mean, that's horrible. So in the hole were multiple people there at one time. Was it like, again, you said solitary. So no. But yeah, I was going to say, I mean, even just by yourself, that's horrible. Is it the same hole that they use for other people? Because, so no toilet is horrible because... Right.
Yeah. My science brain is like, oh my gosh, the microbes that must be there.
Yes.
It gives me the impression that there, of course, was negativity before the hauntings. No wonder it feels like such a negative space and such a looming presence because the history alone and these reform tactics alone are so vastly negative.
Yes.
Moving on from reform tactics, we're going to talk a little bit about famous occurrences that have happened there. There was an escape attempt. And it happened in 1945. And in this attempt, 12 prisoners dug a tunnel outside of the wall, which is always an amazing thing to me. I mean, I guess you have nothing to do, but it's very Shawshank Redemption.
Yes.
There was one prisoner who was actually a stonemason that created a false panel that fooled the guards so they couldn't see the tunnel.
That's so clever.
I know. How lucky are those other 11 people that they were imprisoned with a stonemason that could help them?
Right.
That's got to be one in how many chances. And they did escape. They actually got out, but they were caught within a few hours because they had decided to escape in broad daylight.
That is a choice. I'm wondering if there was like a specific reason for that because you would think nighttime. Listen, I would think nighttime,
Right.
but I've never been in that situation. So maybe there was a good reason for it. I mean, maybe they felt like there was less guard presence in the daytime. Like maybe there were more patrols at night.
That's what I'm thinking, is they probably watch so carefully at night that during the day, maybe people are distracted or taking it less seriously, or there could be more things happening throughout the day. Prisoners coming in, prisoners leaving, prisoners going outside for rec, stuff like that. You know, in general, that would happen. So maybe they thought they'll be distracted, we can get ahead of them. And they were unfortunately all caught.
That's so sad.
One of the famous people here, like a big claim to fame for Eastern State, was that Al Capone actually served time here. And his cell is still set up today, so you can go see it with all of the luxuries that he had there.
Oh.
Yeah, it's like he had rugs. I think he had a radio. He had chairs, stuff like that. He had a lot of things that other prisoners did not.
Right, which is interesting. I mean, maybe not even interesting. Maybe that's not the correct word, but that must have been horrible for the other prisoners.
Well, he's Al Capone. He gets whatever he wants.
Yes.
And he served 7 months there. We'll actually revisit him a little bit later.
Okay.
The structure was a place of many murders and countless deaths. So it's no wonder, given first the torturous treatment, second the many deaths, third, overall, the negativity that we typically see with penitentiaries, prisons, etc.
Right.
That the place is said to be haunted.
Hello, my name is Brandon, founder of Haunted US. Thank you so much for listening. We really hope you're enjoying our new podcast, Haunted Atlas. If you're enjoying our exploration of the darkest history and most chilling places across the United States, you can support us directly by taking a moment to give Haunted Atlas a review on iTunes. And if it's not too much to ask, tell a friend you think would enjoy our deep dives into America's haunted history. Thank you again for listening.
Without further ado, time for the paranormal claims. And there are quite a few here. So,
I bet.
Yeah, and it's a big place, but we're going to break it down by area.
Perfect.
So first, Cellblock 12. It was actually not built until 1911, so a significant amount of time from when it initially opened. And it differs a bit from the surrounding cells because of this. It features less space in the cell and small, narrow windows, and it's known for echoing voices and cackling that seem to bounce off the walls here.
Is the whole cell block more secluded and like, would it give way to more echoes? Does that make sense? Or is it just the particular specific cells that are smaller than other cell blocks?
It's just the cells within the cell block. So I think the goal was to fit more prisoners. I don't know that for certain, but I'm guessing that's why they did it.
Okay.
And so they reduced the size of the windows and they reduced the size of the cells.
Okay.
So they could fit more in, is my thought. My initial thought was, is it just tighter spaces? And so it's more echoey off the stone?
Right.
But the cackling is also something that's a little strange.
Yes.
I think it's very possible that people could lose a bit of their typical emotional regulation while here. So maybe the cackling's not that far off.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I agree with you. I think, again, silence and solitary confinement can really lead to your mind getting disoriented.
It's right next to Cellblock 6, which is also known to be haunted. And so I wonder if, even though it's distinguished by Cellblock, they're somehow tied together. Because Cellblock 6 is known for shadowy figures that dart along the walls. And I think since they're moving and not stationary, it's very possible that this could be shadow figures that are traveling between the cell blocks.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
And maybe they're the cackling ones.
Right.
Cellblock 4 is also haunted. And it's known for visions of ghostly faces that happen.
So just the face?
That is the claim. But there's a bit more to it. So
Okay.
let me tell you a story about one of the people that used to work there. His name was Gary Johnson, and he helped maintain the locks at the prison because he was there in the 1990s. So it had been around for over 100 years. It no longer was operating as the prison, but he was just there to, maintain the historical fidelity of the building.
Right.
So it's the early 1990s. He just opens an old lock in cell block 4, and he feels this really powerful force grip him so tightly that he's unable to move.
Oh boy, that's terrifying.
Right?
Because like your first reaction when anything happens that's scary is to run. So if you're just stuck there in a cell, I think I would be so scared that the door was going to close me in.
Oh, I didn't think about that. I just thought about how startling it must have been for him if he was in the penitentiary regularly and took care of the locks and never had a negative experience.
Right.
To have such a physical experience.
Yeah.
He described also a negative, horrible energy that seemed to explode out of the cell. Following this, he said tormented faces appeared on the cell walls, and in particular one that beckoned to him.
Huh. So sort of like a siren call?
I guess. I think just maybe trying to engage him. And I was wondering if the feeling of being held tightly was the spirits that are there trying to communicate how they felt. Because it doesn't sound like it's necessarily just one.
Yeah.
Given that there's many tormented faces appearing on the walls.
I'd be interested to know if it was his first time in that room as well. I mean, I don't know, but maybe him just entering it sort of set off whatever spirits were in there.
That's true. Or maybe because he was messing with the lock, that could have been very triggering for any spirits that might be there. Even if he was unlocking it, it could still be exploding out of the cell because they can finally get out.
Yeah, that's true.
If it was me and my place of work, it would make me very hesitant to return to work the next day.
I would quit.
That's it, point blank, done.
Yeah, no, I'd be done. Okay. If I got stuck somewhere and then there was like a negative blast of, yeah, no, I'd be done.
You're like, all right, I'm a head out. I think this place is haunted.
Right.
What a funny thing to say in your HR exit interview.
Yeah.
Why'd you quit? Location is haunted.
Yes.
That's funny. There's also Block 15, which was death row, and unsurprisingly, known to be haunted. There are reports of shadow figures running in these corridors and screams in the area. A Buzzfeed investigation there actually captured the EVPs of these screams, so there is some evidence of that. There's always concerns about echoing in large stone buildings, so it is important to note they do sound like distinct screams, but you always have to be wary of echoing.
Right. I think screams, honestly, on an EVP, it sounds like it would be scary, but I think it's more just sad. Mm-hmm. That's like a terrifying thing that someone's in the afterlife and unable to get themselves, communicate with others except in a scream.
Yeah. And to be trapped on death row must be a terrible thing, assuming that they're trapped and that's why they're screaming. But to be trapped on death row sounds absolutely terrible, although it could be a residual haunting versus a distinct spirit. That's always how I break it down mentally for myself.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just the residual hauntings and negative energy. Al Capone. He's back again.
What a guy.
A bit more of the history before we jump into his story. He did have some turmoil in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So some people allege that he actually got incarcerated in Pennsylvania on purpose so that he was protected while things were going down in Chicago. And it gave it a little bit of time to quiet down.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Right. Especially because he had all these connections. He had all this money. He could have a relatively plush incarceration.
Yeah, that's exactly where my mind went. I think, if you are going to have all of these amenities in your cell that other prisoners wouldn't have received, and so it's not really that scary of an experience for you, of course, that makes sense over dealing with whatever you've caused in another state.
Right. And what better protection than being in a penitentiary?
Yeah.
And having your own cell.
Right. Because really no one can get in without a valid reason.
Right. And you have enough money to pay people off. You have connections to pay people off. So kind of maybe genius.
Yeah, definitely clever.
I don't like calling like a crime boss a genius, but
it's a smart thing to do. Yeah.
Whether it's true or not that he was avoiding turmoil in Chicago, what is true is that he was tormented here by the paranormal. And that's true based on other people's reports.
So when he was there was already reports of hauntings occurring. Interesting.
Specific to him, which I think is really cool.
Yes.
He would scream for Jimmy to leave him alone. And people that were on his cell block reported that he would scream around the clock.
Is there a significance to Jimmy?
Yes.
Oh,
so
okay.
Who is Jimmy?
Yeah.
Glad you asked. Al Capone was the leader for the St. Valentine's Massacre, and a man named Jimmy, full name James Clark, was killed in it. And to this day, paranormal investigators claim that Jimmy's spirit is lingering near the cell. So because he was the lead on that and Jimmy perished in the massacre, he was there tormenting Al Capone. Honestly, good for him.
Yeah. Makes sense.
You're going to do something in your afterlife. Let's make it vengeful.
Right. Especially if it's not your choice to be stuck wherever you're stuck.
But I think it's interesting because a lot of times people consider the spirits of a location to be stationary and stuck there. But this is a more dynamic one where it's linked to the specific person and not the specific location. However, it sounds like there is some additional linkage to the location if he is still lingering near the cell.
The only thing I can think is maybe he felt like he had done enough when, during Al Capone's time there and decided to stay. But yeah, I did also, when you mentioned that he was still there, think that was interesting that he didn't follow Al Capone to wherever he next went. Or maybe he did, but this was the most significant place that he haunted Al Capone. So maybe he came back.
That's what I was thinking is once Al Capone died, maybe he came back, or maybe this was one of the first locations he went to after he died. And so he kind of became more tied to it.
Yes.
We can't be sure, but I love a petty ghost so much.
Fantastic.
Next is perhaps my favorite inmate. Al Capone's notable. This one, my favorite. This is Pep, who is probably the most unique story about this penitentiary. Local legend says that Pep was a black Labrador retriever sentenced to life without parole.
Okay. What?
In August of 1924, Pep was sentenced for killing Governor Gifford Pinchett's cat. That's unfortunately not the real story.
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, that's kind of crazy that a dog was sentenced.
Well, the governor's cat.
I
Connections.
know. I mean, clearly an important matter that needed to be looked into.
Yes. And in 1924, I feel like it was all about who you know and who was in power. I mean, it's not that different today. But at least there was less of a paper trail back then.
Yeah.
So he was actually a therapy dog. And so he was brought in by this warden that was trying to work on reform. And I think this is such a juxtaposition to the techniques that were being used and the silence. But at least they had a therapy dog.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the therapy dog is nice for sure. And a much nicer story, I think, than a dog getting sentenced to life. So that's good. And I hope that it helped in some way. I mean, we know how impactful animals can be. And
the confusion, I think, comes because Pep was actually given an inmate number, which was C-2559, and had his own mugshot.
Oh, heck yeah. That's amazing.
I know. Pep the dog.
Is there a significance to C-2559? Is that like what is the unit now? Is it the K2 unit? So that way
K9.
K9.
Are you just realizing that K9 is K9?
Yep.
Heard it here first, folks. For those that are listening and might not have known, thank Pep the dog. Yeah, no, I think it was just probably in the sequence.
Random number. Gotcha.
Yeah. And I wonder why they even gave him an inmate number. Maybe to make the prisoners feel like he was one of them.
Right.
Or maybe it was just a cutesy thing and they were bored.
Yeah.
The cutest haunting is that Pep is still reportedly running through the cell blocks down the halls.
Oh.
I know. I love it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Visitors report hearing his spirit in the form of dog tags clinking and even barks or howls.
Which is, I think that's very nice that his presence is still there. I mean, I think when we talk about places like this, it can sometimes be hard to think of the people as real people, you know, when you're just talking about numbers or, I mean, that's just true of anything in general, not even just the paranormal. But I think it's really nice to think about a dog that must have at least brought comfort to some of the inmates there, sticking around, and maybe does that for some of them in the afterlife now.
Right. And it's such a diverse cast of characters that haunt this location to me, because you have Pep, who's like the shining positivity, like you're saying, and then you have a person who tormented Al Capone. You have the negative force pushing people in.
Right.
You have all the shadow figures who we don't know as much about, but it's quite a spread.
Yes.
In terms of positive and negative.
Yeah.
And I would love to see this because it's my understanding that there aren't animals allowed. I'm sure service animals are allowed in. So if you see a dog there on its own, it must be Pep.
Right.
We have to go for that reason alone.
Correct.
And try to find Pep.
Yes.
Bring dog treats, dog toys, squeaky balls.
Oh, dog tags.
Yeah, there we go. We'll find him. So there are also general hauntings related to the hallways. There are specifically claims that an apparition will stand at the end of long hallways in the oldest sections of the prison. Because remember, some were built in the 1910s. So in the older sections, this apparition will stand at the end of the hall and it will stand still until it's approached and then dash away and disappear.
I think that would be so far. That's the freakiest haunting, I think. Because I'm always so concerned that I'm going to look in a certain direction and see something. You know, I think that's why I kind of get scared on investigations or when I'm like thinking about entering either haunted places or just even like creepy things where people might be. It's the thought of possibly seeing something. And so if I'm walking down a hallway and I can visibly see a person at the end,
yeah.
I mean, I'd probably run in the opposite direction. Who is approaching this person?
Me, if I'm there.
That's fair.
But I think it's interesting because it's standing. Maybe it realizes that it's a ghost. And then it's like, oh no, this person can see me. And then it runs away.
Interesting. Yeah.
The other theory is maybe it's an inmate. We don't know for sure. It could be a guard. Maybe it's an inmate. And it thinks that you're a guard approaching, so it's running from you in that way. Those are my two theories about why it would be running away.
Yeah, I think the first one makes sense if you think of terms of like social anxiety. Like the person's just like, I gotta get out of here.
Yeah.
Please do not perceive me. I'm not interested in being perceived at the end of this hallway.
And interestingly, a similar apparition with similar behavior is seen outside near the guard towers and even on the guard towers, which makes me wonder if this is the same person or simply the same behavior. What do you think?
I almost want to say different person, same behavior, because it feels to me like the person in the hallway is very specifically in the hallways.
Yeah, and I think in terms of how a penitentiary operates, it would be unlikely for the person in the hallway to also be on the guard tower unless they are indeed a guard.
Yeah.
Which, if they are a guard, I don't think it makes as much sense for them to run away.
Yes, I agree with you. I agree.
So I think they could be different people. But it would be interesting to try to connect with them, see if you could get any EVPs on who they are, a name, etc. So next, I'm going to talk about the hauntings of Eastern State in pop culture. It has been featured on various paranormal shows. It's been on Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, and MTV's Fear. And Ghost Hunters probably had the biggest reaction of any of these episodes.
Right.
They caught a controversial piece of evidence on camera, which we love to see.
Yeah.
And this was a shadow figure that was moving on the camera. It seemed to come towards and then go away.
Oh.
Kind of like the darting shadow figures that we discussed.
Yes.
And it was considered controversial because I think everyone's normally skeptical of these shows. Is it someone on the team? Did they edit it in a certain way?
Right.
But in order to try to prove that it is valid, they actually published the video and made it available so anyone can take a look at it and they can decide for themselves.
Oh, that's really cool that they published that.
Yeah. And I think it's really important. We always say, you know, being in the paranormal community, we want to make sure that we're debunking as much as we can.
Yes.
And they had debunked other pieces of evidence, but this one, they said that they were unable to replicate it any way that they tried.
Yeah.
So we can put a link to that for listeners to go look at and everyone can decide for themselves.
Yeah, that's a really cool piece of evidence to take a look at.
Yeah. And I think just it being so concrete that it was captured on video, they try to debunk it, they're making it available, but it is controversial.
Yeah.
Those are all of the hauntings of Eastern State.
I actually really like learning and talking about Eastern State. I feel like every single time we talk about it, I just feel like I hear more and learn more about it.
Yeah, and given the brevity of a podcast, we only can go so far into the history section. There's so much there.
Right.
And you can visit for historical tours, you can visit for Halloween attractions. So definitely a cool place to visit. Regardless of your love of hauntings, the history alone is a reason to go. And there's always more to learn. Every time I've been there, I've learned something new. But we'd be really interested to hear about your experience, listeners. So if you have been to Eastern State Penitentiary, we want to hear about what you thought about the history, the hauntings, and everything in between. So you can reach us via email at theteam@hauntedus.com. Please mention Haunted Atlas Episode 1 in the subject line. Or you can find us on Instagram at hauntedus, give us a follow, and send us a message about your experience at Eastern State Penitentiary. Thank you so much for listening to our first episode, and be sure to tune in for the next one to see where we drop the pin next on our adventure across the haunted US. This episode of Haunted Atlas was presented by Sarah Sweeney and Erica Barrett. Researched by Sarah Sweeney, with research assistance by Mitch Goth. Production assistance by David Sweeney. Our executive producer is Brandon Rugsey. Haunted Atlas is a production of Haunted US. Visit hauntedus.com for more information.